I love this land. It takes my breath away.
Welcome to Texas 10. I'm Melissa.
And I'm Telescope Steve.
I thought you were going to be stargazing Steve.
Well, I'm stargazing Steve,
I'm kind
too.
of disappointed in Telescope
Okay,
Steve.
well.
Anyway, we are here today with a friend who knows a lot about the black skies and stars, and you'll be surprised as to why. We're here with André Bormanis. Now I messed it up. I'm sorry. After I was bragging to Steve that I pronounced it correctly. Well, anyway, we are so thrilled to have you today, André, and we are excited to talk about
Dark skies.
Dark skies.
Yes. All right, André, say hi to our Texas 10 watchers.
Hey guys, nice to meet you all virtually here.
All right, and you're coming to us from West LA, correct?
West LA. Yeah.
Right, and so your career path, I told you off camera, super interesting career path, and you ended up in the film production business, right?
Yeah, kind of a crazy path. I never thought this is where I would end up when I was a, high school kid and even in college and after college. So, I was born in Chicago, Illinois, but my family moved to Phoenix, Arizona when I was a little kid back in the mid 60s. And back then, even Phoenix, relatively dark skies for a city. And, you could just kind of barely see the Milky Way in the summer from our backyard. And so I started to get interested in astronomy, really fell in love with it after a camping trip. In like about 1970, I think. Went on a camping trip with the Boy Scouts to Sedona, Arizona, and Oak Creek Canyon.
Gorgeous, gorgeous land and gorgeous sky.
Gorgeous land, gorgeous sky. And I couldn't believe it. We walked 20, 30 yards from the campfire first night out there to look up at the night sky because we had to get away from the light from the campfire, and we knew that. And the Milky Way was like a solid band of white light going from one horizon to the other. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing.
Can I ask how old you were about then?
I was 11 years old.
Okay, all right.
And that year I also got my first look through a telescope at the planet Saturn. And it was a small telescope, kind of like the one that's sitting there in the corner by the piano. And yet I could see the little disc and the little ring around it, and it literally took my breath away. I gasped when I saw it, and I was hooked. I was totally hooked. So, fast forward to me in college. I majored in physics and astronomy at the University of Arizona, did some graduate work there in astronomy, planetary science, got to observe up on Kitt Peak with one of the astronomers I worked with, then started to kind of veer off into this is in the early 1980s, and laptop computers and the IBM PC were becoming a big thing, and I got involved in that business for a few years, developed some astronomy software for a company, which was a lot of fun, and then I went into sort of the politics and policy side of all things. I got offered a NASA fellowship to do 2 years and a master's degree at George Washington University, doing policy work for NASA, which was really fascinating. And it involved a lot of writing. I always had kind of the creative writing bug, and I'd taken some classes in script writing and short stories and that sort of thing. Always thought that would just be kind of a hobby. But speaking of McDonald Observatory down there where you are, Carl Sagan was my hero growing up. And
a lot of people.
About Carl was that he was not only a brilliant scientist, but a great writer. And I was so impressed by how well he wrote. And I wanted to I aspired to be able to write half as well as Carl about astronomy and space science and stuff. Well, that interest is what ultimately landed me this job back in 1993 as the science advisor for the Star Trek: The Next Generation TV show, which was entering its last season.
Okay, I gotta ask you this: how does that connection get made? Like, did you reach out to them? Did they reach out to you? What?
That is a long story in and of itself. The nutshell version is they had a policy back in the 80s where anybody could send in a script for consideration. You didn't have to have an agent, you didn't have to have a manager or whatever. If you wrote a script and it was in the right sort of format and it was, it's something that was readable and not just craziness, somebody on their staff would read it and say, yeah, yes or no. Mostly no.
Right.
But, a couple of really good writers got their starts that way, submitting these so-called spec scripts, speculative submission. And I wrote one in the late 80s and sent it in, and it came back to me in the mail a couple of months later with a very nice thanks but no thanks from one of the producers, and he encouraged me to try again. He said, not what we're looking for right now, but hey, this is good work and blah, blah, blah. And in the meantime, I'm doing this stuff, in Washington, D.C., and thinking that that's where my life was going to be heading. But happened to find out, I had a friend working in Hollywood as a TV writer on the comedy side. He knew an agent who I eventually talked to some other agent, and she was trying to see if she could get me a meeting to pitch some more stories to Star Trek when she found out that they needed a new science consultant. And they wanted somebody with both the science background, but somebody who also knew the show and knew how to read a script and knew how to talk to other writers. Because a lot of the people that they'd hired were like just straight scientists who would read a script. Hey, you can't do that. That's dumb. It's
We got to entertain people
tell me
here.
how to make this work. Right. So I had a little more. I had better social skills, let's say, than a lot of the scientists that they talked to. So I had a conversation with one of the producers. She and I hit it off over the phone. She invited me to come meet the rest of the staff. They interviewed me and had me do notes on a script to see if I could do the job. They liked that. And they needed me to start literally to the week that my NASA fellowship in DC ended, May of 1993.
Wow.
All the stars aligned.
And I drove to LA, started working as the science consultant on Star Trek.
That is a complete left turn.
So I was just going to say, I just said, no pun intended, but all the stars aligned.
The stars aligned. And, I do kind of think of it that way. I'm not necessarily a big believer in fate.
Right.
But it did feel like, I loved the original Star Trek when I was growing up.
Well, and there is a Texas connection to the original Star Trek.
Absolutely. Gene Roddenberry, who created the original Star Trek, born and raised in El Paso.
Which is...
He was Texan. And I can't help but imagine that those the big skies, those dark nights must have inspired him too.
Right.
He actually became a pilot in World War II. He was a bomber pilot in Europe during the war, and he was reading science fiction. He loved the stars. He knew someday he got into TV writing through, again, another very weird backdoor kind of a thing. He became a commercial pilot and then a motorcycle cop in Los Angeles in the 1950s.
Wow, okay.
Yeah.
But he would watch these cop shows, and he'd write notes to the producers and the writers and say, that's not how a cop would do this.
Right.
And then he started writing some scripts, and he actually drove his motorcycle up to some studio in his police uniform and stuff and handed them a script and said, I'd really like you to read this. I think it's pretty good. So he was very bold.
Right. Yeah.
He was bold going where no man has gone before. Right?
I like the authenticity, though. You can trust me on this because I'm okay. So that got you into it, and then you have been wildly successful in sort of the science film, the connection that you got into. Just roll off your credits real quick so people understand what you
it was the Star Trek thing that really got everything rolling, and after I'd been there for a year or so, I started to pitch some stories, and I had to pitch like 15 before they bought one. But then they bought another one like the next month that I pitched earlier that had been sitting on the back burner somewhere. And then they asked me to write a script. They liked that well enough for me to do another one. And one of the guys that I worked with, I was involved in Star Trek for a total of 12 years.
Oh, wow.
From 1993 to 2005. First as a consultant, then a freelance writer, and then a staff writer and producer on the Star Trek Enterprise show. And through all of that, I was working with a writer named Brannon Braga. And Brannon, he was a young staff writer when I was hired as the science consultant. And we talked a lot, about science and stories, and I gave him notes, in his scripts like I did with everybody else. And then we wrote a script together for the Star Trek Voyager show, and we really worked well together, and we really liked how the script turned out. And so when he started and co-created this Star Trek Enterprise show, he said, "Hey, join the writing staff. We should have put you on staff a long time ago, but let's do this."
And you said, "Yeah, you're right." But
Yeah. So that lasted 4 years, and then we did another show together, and then didn't work for a while. But then Cosmos came along, and Brannon was friends with Seth MacFarlane, who best known for this Family Guy show.
Yeah.
But Seth was a huge fan of Carl Sagan. He was a big fan of the original Cosmos when he was growing up. And he found out that Carl's widow, Ann Druyan, was trying to make another version of the series, but couldn't get it set up anywhere. And when Seth found out about this, he said, "Oh, let me take it to Fox." And so Seth was like the cash cow at Fox at that time.
Right.
Family Guy became this huge, ridiculous hit, and made tons of money for Fox. And so when Seth said, "I'd really like to do this Cosmos show," Fox said, "Tell me when you want to start."
they said, "Yes, we would still like to keep showing your Family Guy show." So yeah.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly how it works, as we say.
Well,
And so Seth actually was a guest star on 2 episodes of Star Trek Enterprise, which is how Brandon met him. One of our writers had worked on Family Guy. Seth was a big fan of Star Trek. And so he had a couple of bit parts on the show, and that's how we got to know him a little bit. He and Brandon became friends, and so when this new Cosmos came along, he invited Brandon, as a veteran science fiction writer who loved astronomy as well, and was very science literate, to do this new version. And Brandon called me because the astronomer who was going to, serve as their kind of science consultant, had to drop out because of other professional commitments. And I had met Carl once, and
met your hero. That's pretty cool, isn't it?
yeah, and was so thrilled to meet him. And he was there with his wife Anne, and they had written a book together, and Anne had remembered meeting me, and Brandon had recommended me to her, and so we got together, and she said, "Wow, I think this would be terrific to have you involved," and we ended up doing 2 seasons of Cosmos. And I have to say, I love being at this kind of intersection of real science, real astronomy, and television production, both in the fiction and the documentary side. Because, I've always had this kind of like tension between wanting to really dive into the science, but also wanting to share it with people and to write about it and to produce TV shows about it. So I've been really blessed to just have this opportunity.
I was going to say blessed is probably an understatement, because on the fiction side, there's not a more iconic franchise than Star Trek in your world, and then on the documentary side, there's not a more iconic production than Cosmos. So that's sort of like being
the best of both worlds.
Exactly, the best left-handed hitter and the best right-handed hitter. So
and my 2 favorite TV shows as a kid.
Right.
I mean, it's crazy.
Right.
And when I was watching Star Trek in high school, it was in reruns. I was too young to watch it when it was first on.
Right.
I vaguely remember seeing an episode with my older brother and thinking that's really cool, but I didn't understand what the heck they were talking about. But in high school, it got showed in reruns, and I'd come home from high school in the afternoon. Me and my friends would all watch Star Trek, right? And then Cosmos, I'd started reading Carl Sagan's books when I was 11, 12 years old. And, 2 really formative things in my young life, and never would have imagined that either one of those things would ever be back on television,
right?
Let alone that I would be involved. It's just, it's crazy.
Yeah.
Frankly. It seems like a dream.
Yeah. Well, it does. So tell me a little bit about how you take what you know through astronomy and your physics background and meld that and marry that to your writing.
Well, in science fiction, I realize, of course, that, a show like Star Trek, it's hundreds of years in the future. They have warp drive, they have transporters and things like that. So there's a lot of new science that has to be discovered and new technologies that have to be invented to make something like that possible. So I do have to stretch my imagination on a show like Star Trek, and 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 realize that, there are some things we know today that I think are still going to be true hundreds of years from now. We know the basic structure of the Milky Way galaxy, our home galaxy, the average distance between stars, how long it would take, even if you can travel faster than the speed of light to get from one star to another. That stuff I was always very careful to be true to the real science about, because I think that's well established. That's not going to change. Some basic principles of physics, conservation of energy and things like that. I don't think that's going to change. But we are going to discover new things. And some of the things that we think that we know for sure today are going to be proven to be probably not really true in the future.
Right. Ships aren't falling off the Earth, right?
Or Pluto's.
Now, on a show like Cosmos, well, that's all about what we know today.
Right.
So that was something where I had to hew very close to everything that is, currently understood and accepted in astronomy, space science, and so forth. But we acknowledge the fact that we don't know everything. We'll never know everything. And some of the things we think are true today may be disproven in the future. That's the way science works. But, one of my great pleasures in working on Cosmos, we did a great episode about Gerard Kuiper and Carl Sagan. Gerard Kuiper is an astronomer. He was born in the Netherlands, brilliant guy. Started working in the 1930s, I believe, and was a pioneer in planetary astronomy, studying the planets with large telescopes on the Earth before we had spacecraft that we could send out there. And also these stars called binary stars. Virtually about half of the stars you see in the night sky have companion stars, two stars orbiting the same point in space, their center of gravity, right? Binaries are really common. And so a big part of the research that was done in astronomy in the early 20th century was looking at these binary stars and using this relatively new technique called spectroscopy, where you can take the light of a star and spread it out into a rainbow with a prism, and you see these little black lines in the spectrum. And those black lines are actually kind of like the fingerprints of the elements that make up the atmospheres of those stars. And you can learn a lot, not just about the composition of those stars by looking at their spectra, but how they're moving. Because if they're orbiting some other darker companion that you can't see, their lines actually shift back and forth a little bit through what's called the Doppler effect, right? Like when you hear a train come and the whistle pitch goes up and it goes away, it goes down.
We live by a train crossing, so I know exactly what you're saying.
With light as well as sound, right? And where did Gerard Kuiper do all of his pioneering work? McDonald Observatory.
Well, I'm glad you brought up
there in West Texas.
Yes, when we went to West Texas, like I said, I grew up in San Antonio, so I grew up in a city, and I can remember going to the lake or going someplace and just being in awe of stars, but it was nothing like I saw at McDonald Observatory. And the other thing is, you take kids to a planetarium and they show all the formations but it just doesn't seem real to you. Yeah. And so having that experience was honestly a little life-changing for me. We were just in awe.
And that's such a common experience, and it's sad that, it's only been in the last 150 years or so since, the widespread adoption of electricity that people have lost that ability or that opportunity to see the night sky the way that our ancestors saw it. Imagine living in Waco 150 years ago, what the night sky must have looked like. In Los Angeles 150 years ago, Los Angeles was barely a little cow town 150 years ago. The night skies from the city were great. If you went up into the nearby mountains just an hour or so away, spectacular, right?
Well, and I think
now, electrification, and most people now live in cities, not in the country, right?
Well, I often wonder if the people in the country sleep better because there's that research that talks about all the light. Now there's the Hatch clock, which, yes, I have one, which, simulates kind of that circadian with the lights, and you go to sleep with the light dimming, you wake up with the light, and we don't have that. And I do sleep better, But I think
Hatch is not a sponsor, by the way.
right
But go
now.
ahead.
But I think it is interesting. Tell us a little bit more about nightlight and why it's important to preserve space for that, and what we should do in our own lives every day.
Well, it is kind of a resource. It is a natural resource, the dark night sky, and it's vital for a lot of a lot of the species that are dependent upon that day-night cycle, as you say. There are a lot of nocturnal animals that really depend on that dark night sky. There are beetles that can actually navigate by the light of the Milky Way. They can sense where they are by seeing the Milky Way above them in the night sky, where it is dark enough to see the night sky.
And we're so proud of our GPSs, and a beetle can.
I know. Hey, I live in Los Angeles. It does not have dark skies.
Right.
Right? I don't think I could. When I first moved here, one of the first things a friend of mine who I grew up with, who lived here, gave me as a gift was this thing called a Thomas Guide, a book of maps of Los Angeles. And this thing was it looked like a phone book, right? It's that thick. Every time I went someplace new in LA, I had to look at that Thomas Guide. I almost always got lost every time. Now, of course, I don't have one anymore because we've got the GPS
Right.
on our phone or in our cars or whatever. And you know what? It's amazing. It's brilliant, but it's symbolic of something that we've all lost.
Right.
If I'm out someplace dark where I can see the night sky, I can immediately tell you where north is because I can always find the North Star, right? When I'm in the northern hemisphere. But I can't, when I'm walking around the streets of LA, I have very little idea where. I mean, I kind of know in my neighborhood. You get me out on the freeway, in some other part of town I haven't been to in years.
100%.
Whereas north is or south, and nature is really, we all evolved in this day-night cycle. It's fundamental to our biology. And as you noted, your sleep cycle gets disrupted if you have too much artificial light. It really made some substantial changes, and we're only just really kind of becoming aware of the importance of having that. Certainly the importance for nature and for our environment, for ecosystems. It's becoming clear why that's so vital.
Well,
And so many cities. Tucson is a great example. I went to University of Arizona in Tucson, and Kitt Peak was established there in the 50s and 60s, and they've done a very good job of keeping, the lights pointed at the ground rather than up into the sky, and using the low sodium lighting and all of those kinds of things to preserve that night sky above Kitt Peak.
that's
Not true here in LA so much.
Right,
Yeah.
okay.
Mount Palomar, well, they're kind of restricted now to looking at the brighter things, the brighter
Yeah.
stars, some planetary work. You can still do great work from those sites, and the other advantage of being at a place like McDonald Observatory or some of these other high altitude observatories, you're above a lot of the water vapor in the atmosphere.
Oh,
So
I
the
never knew
skies
that.
tend to be, they have better seeing. The skies tend to be more steady, and you can look at other wavelengths beyond visible light, like into the infrared. You really can't, if you look from here where I am, just about sea level, with an infrared telescope up at the sky, even if it's a perfectly clear night, the water vapor is going to block most of that infrared. You really got to be up at 6, 7, 8,000 feet or more. Higher
Wow.
the better.
That's
To do
interesting.
that kind of work.
super
Or
interesting.
out in space. So
So
there is still a role, even where there's some light pollution for these high altitude observatories. But preserving the darkness is really critical to keeping these facilities, producing the amazing kind of work that's been done at McDonald and these other observatories out here in the West that we started building on mountains back in the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
So I know that there are like designated dark sky areas now. What is that about, and how did that come to be? Sort of, and I know a lot of them are in West Texas, but
Yeah, Big Bend is
yeah,
one.
right.
And
So
Yeah.
talk about a designated.
That was primarily driven by astronomy. We invested millions and millions of dollars in the observatories, and before World War II, the United States was, there were scientists here doing important research in physics, astronomy, and the other sciences. But it really wasn't until after World War II that we became the dominant science power in the world. And astronomy was a big part of that. Astronomy, astrophysics, when we learned how to, do this thing called spectroscopy and figure out the physical properties of stars and planets and so forth. We really, became a powerhouse in the world, and that was very important for the, for the future of the country. Without our investments in science, we wouldn't have all of these technologies
Right.
that we take for granted today, like the computers we're talking over and the internet and GPS and all of these other amazing things, which are valuable things, right? And so the astronomers were the ones in the 50s and 60s who said, hey, the growth of these cities, that's great, but they're messing up the sky. And then the biologists started to realize, especially like in the Sonoran Desert where Tucson is, nocturnal animals, they really need dark skies in order to survive and to live their lives. Because if you hunt at night and then suddenly there's no more real night because you've got all of these lights around, you're probably going to be facing extinction, in a few generations. So the push initially came from astronomy, but it's much bigger than that now. And the night sky is recognized as a kind of a resource in the same way that clean water, clean rivers, clean lakes, and other natural resources are recognized for their value to sustaining this, extraordinary planet that we're all, blessed to live on. And we have to be aware. We have to be aware of the impact that we have, especially, when I was born way back in the 1950s.
Yeah.
There were 3 billion people on this planet.
Right.
That was a lot, right?
Right.
That's 8 billion now. We got to learn to live a little
Right.
bit more lightly on the land. It doesn't mean you have to give up anything, critical, but and I think that anybody who looks through a telescope and sees, say, Saturn, anybody who goes to McDonald Observatory and spends the night and sees those dark skies, you get it. You just get it at a gut level because this is part of our human heritage. It's part of what drove science in the first place. The first science was astronomy. And think for how many thousands of years, everybody who lived anywhere on the earth would see that Milky Way
Right.
every night, that it was clear, right?
Well, I saw an interesting PBS story about dark skies, and it talked about there was an earthquake in LA, and you lost all your power, and people were calling in because they saw this phenomenon in the sky, and they said, "What is that? Is it end times?" And
I was here for that. That was my first earthquake. It happened literally about 6-7 months after I moved here.
And so tell us, what was that phenomenon in the sky?
Yeah, I went out, after I, recovered from
Right.
the shock.
Right.
And I'll tell you, the shaking was terrible. I lived in a first floor of a 3-story building in an apartment. And I swear, it was 4:30 in the morning, I think. I knew that I'd feel an earthquake one of these days, right? But I didn't know it would happen in the middle of the night when I'm dead asleep and it's pitch black outside. And it felt like a giant had come up to the apartment building and just started shaking it. But the other part that I wasn't prepared for was the noise, the sound. It was deafening. It was like there was a freight train right behind my bedroom window. I almost had to cover my ears. And once I finally found my footing and tried to make it first I walked into the bedroom closet. I didn't know where I was.
It wasn't a
30
tornado.
seconds of shaking, and then it finally started to calm down. And I went out the front door, and there was a pool in the courtyard, beyond my apartment door. There were 2-foot waves in the pool. And of course, all the lights in LA were out. And once I kind of got my bearings, got my wits about me, I looked up at the sky, and my God, there was the Milky Way. I spent the next hour or so checking on, all the neighbors came out.
Right.
We all started talking to each other and make sure everybody was okay and that sort of stuff. But then, man, I just looked at that night sky and I thought, you know what? It's probably the only time I'm ever going to be able to see the Milky
And
Way.
to
from
think
here
that
in
there
Los
are
Angeles.
so many people that have never seen the Milky Way.
Right.
You read about it as a child in science, and I think every young child is always very intrigued and interested by astronomy. but to get to actually experience it is amazing.
Right. So, quick side note: my dad was in that same earthquake. He was on a business trip and said he was thrown out of bed. It actually, yeah. So, but back to the dark sky thing. It seems to me like, so I understand the physical need for dark skies, right? It's a resource, like you said. It seems to me like it may be the last resource we're reaching. We worried about the water, we worried about the air, we worried about litter back in the 70s, and now we're saying, oh, up there too. But talk a little bit about, and I know between Cosmos and Star Trek, you have a lot of intersection with what I would say is human philosophy too, and the ability to see beyond us, right, and understand what's actually up there, and the loss of that if you don't have dark skies.
Yeah, one of the things that the most really amazing thing to me about the universe is its transparency. The fact that we can see so far out into space. A telescope with a mirror no bigger than the roof of a small house can see billions of light years away into space. Billions of light years. And we think that the universe began 13, 14 billion years ago in this massive expansion called the Big Bang and so forth. Well, you can, with the telescopes up on, at McDonald Observatory, the Hobby Eberly telescope is their newest instrument up there. It's got a 400 plus inch mirror, segmented mirror, but,
Right.
huge aperture. But, again, that's not that big, really, in the grand scheme of things. It can see all the way back to the beginning of time. It's observed quasars at the very limits of when we think, the universe started to form and make these things. That's astonishing to me. How is it that we can see that far with instruments that have now been around for, 100 and some odd years?
Quite frankly, it's mind-boggling. I
Right.
mean, you can't. I can't wrap my head around it.
Well, that's
I really can't. And I think it's a shame that you can't see it and to have that experience.
and I guess the point I'm getting to is Gene Roddenberry, when he was growing up, had those experiences. Carl Sagan, when he was growing up, had those sort of experience and sparked that sort of creative thought and their commentary on the universe.
Yeah.
And then if you don't have that on an everyday level, it seems a loss to me.
Well, everybody who gets out under a dark sky, and if it's their first time or maybe not their first time, but if they're people who aren't professional astronomers, they always start asking themselves those big questions. They want to know. You look up and it's like, how far is that? How did this begin? And Carl Sagan observed up at McDonald Observatory one summer, the late 40s, I think, with Gerard Kuiper, who was the director at that time, and he was a mentor to Carl. And Carl, in his memoirs and his writings, talks about the fact that, when the skies clouded over, or even when they were there at the eyepiece of the telescope looking at Mars or whatever, they would inevitably start having these deep philosophical conversations. Because when you're under that sky and you're looking up at this extraordinary, incredible universe we're so privileged to be able to experience for whatever time we have here on the earth, we're just all naturally curious. And the dark night sky is one of the best ways I know of stimulating that curiosity. And I've been on any number of public star parties, been with people who've never looked through a telescope before and shown them something, and that's where their mind immediately goes.
So
agree.
I overheard the PBS show she was watching just briefly, and one of the comments struck me really hard and positively, which is, while water pollution and land pollution, there's a lot of work that you have to do to remediate it, and it doesn't immediately go away. But for light pollution, you just have to turn the light down.
Well, you know, and it's
Easiest thing in the
interesting.
world.
Right.
If you drive into Dallas, Texas now, they have these interesting lights, and I always wondered, I thought, why did they put street lights like that? And they have a different color, and they are facing down.
Right.
And I'm assuming that that's why. And then just even thinking about landscaping your house. It always looks so pretty when you have the uplights and you, well, it's maybe rethink, well, no, that's just vanity, and you're stealing the night sky when you do something like that. The other thing about that show that really got me was they talked about the 9/11 tribute that they do every year with the big lights in the sky, and how when it started, like hundreds of birds died because they went into the light. They went to the light. But that it was so disruptive, even in a city that does not have dark skies. So
No, it's,
fascinating.
street lights do you no good if they're pointing up into the sky.
Right.
You want that light pointing down on the ground where you need it so you can see where you're going, right? And it's amazing to me that, from the beginning, they weren't putting hoods, on these street lights to shine the light down because, it only makes sense. It saves money because you don't need as much electricity for not wasting half of the light
Right.
shining it up into the air, right? And those kind of yellow lights that a lot of people find annoying, they're called low pressure sodium. Well, they only emit a couple of specific wavelengths of light, and they're in a part of the spectrum that the astronomers aren't that interested in. So it preserves the darkness of all of those other bands of light that the astronomers want to observe. So it's a very carefully thought out kind of a thing that they do with that. And also, we waste so much money. When at night here in LA, I see all these office buildings. Why are there lights on? Why are there
Right.
so many
Right.
lights on? Nobody's in there working. Why don't they turn off the lights? You
Well,
know how much money we
I
spend on
I think
electricity
the other
for
thing
lighting that
is,
isn't
you
used?
look
It's
in a
crazy.
city like we're talking about El Paso, and you can look across and see all the lights. Well, earlier we were talking about El Paso. You can see all across the lights. You say, "Oh, how beautiful the lights of the city are," and I'm thinking, no, what's really beautiful is if you can look into the sky, and it takes education. And so many of our children are in big urban areas, and they never have that experience. I think that's why Classroom of the Earth kinds of things, experiences where you can take your kids out of the city, so that they can have some of these experiences.
Boy Scout trips.
Well, yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah, just being out in nature.
Right,
When I was in the
right.
Boy Scouts back in Arizona, we would take inner city kids on some of our hiking and camping trips. And there was a place, Camp Geronimo, just under the Mogollon Rim near Payson. Beautiful, beautiful place. Still love the Mogollon Rim. It's a great place to hike and to camp and to ride horses. And man, these kids, they've never been outside of the city. They've never been in a pine forest, let alone seen the night sky. And it was world changing for them. It was initially very frightening because they were used to closed spaces.
Closed spaces, a lot of light, right? That's, right. So you mentioned a couple of technologies, and I feel like there's maybe more awareness of this. It's in its early stages. Like I remember, you're sort of our age. You probably remember the Native American with the tear.
The pollution.
Advertisement for that was just littering, right? And so,
Right.
but eventually people got better about littering, and I sort of feel like we're at that stage with this, with the light
Protecting the
pollution,
dark skies,
protecting
I
the
think
dark
that's
skies.
right. Yeah, I think there was pushback initially. There were a lot of people who complained in Tucson when they were starting to do that, and they're like, "Oh, I can't see. It's too dark. It's scary. What if I get in a car accident? What if I get mugged? I'm not going to be able to provide, identification because it's too dark." Well, no, it's actually not too dark. You just have to recognize that it's a little different. It doesn't render, color the same way, but at night, even white light at night doesn't accurately reflect color the way that the sunlight does during the day. So it's a change, and people tend to resist change.
We don't
It
like
can be a
change.
little bit, but ultimately, when you explain to people, when they realize the import, especially if they go to a dark site and look at the sky and see what they're missing because of all this light, then that really changes minds pretty quickly.
Well, one of the big things that changes minds is media.
Right.
And I think being able to explore these sort of topics, we do it in a very small way. You've done it in very big ways between Star Trek and Cosmos, and we can't thank you enough for your time and expertise today. And it makes me want to go back to McDonald's.
I was just thinking that. We have a 5-year-old grandson, and I'm dying to take him out there. And when I was reading, I also learned that McDonald Observatory has education grants for teachers. And there's so much out there. And I just encourage people, if you are anywhere where you could get to one of these great observatories in our country, but here in Texas, McDonald Observatory, that is a treasure. And to be able to have that and to have that preserved space through Big Bend in West Texas where McDonald Observatory is, I just encourage our listeners who are Texas centric to plan a trip. It takes planning because it's a ways out there, but once you get there, it will be well worth it.
Oh, and McDonald Observatory has great public outreach. They do the Stardate radio program. They have overnight programs. You can arrange to look through one of the big scopes up there, which, I've looked through the 60-inch telescope on Mount Wilson. It's amazing. You can look through the 82-inch up on, at McDonald. And it's on my bucket list, or my life bucket list.
The McDonald Star Parties are great because you get to go to each, you get to go to each telescope, and you just can't believe what you're seeing. And all of a sudden, the planetarium makes a little sense. You're like, oh.
You can go back to the planetarium and say, I see what you're
now
saying.
I get
So
it.
isn't it better to see it in real life in nature and to see the stars in space and you don't have to be the astronaut.
It's like going to a live concert and
Right.
then listening to the album again.
Right.
Perfect analogy.
Right.
Yeah, it really is.
Well,
and
Andre-
one of these days, now that I know you guys and I know that Malcolm and Vanessa are out there, I'm definitely going to make a point of coming
Okay,
out.
come
Yes.
on. We'll
And
meet you there.
Right, and the other thing, you're right about their outreach. I listen to Stardate on NPR all the time, and the thing that I was overwhelmed with, because we don't have 1/1000th of your background in it, it was so hard to keep up with all of the information you were getting at the same time. You were being stunned by these visuals. So I would really encourage people who are going to make a trip, especially with younger kids, like 11. I think that's a great age to be there, like when you had your first experience. But do a little preparation before you get there, because it is hard to process, or hard for me to process. There's just so much great information. And like I said, all you want to do is gaze, right?
And start working on your neck flexibility because you're sitting at that. They start you in this amphitheater and you're looking up, and after a while you're like, okay.
Yeah, well, bring a blanket.
Right.
All right, so there you go.
Yes.
And even in your hot Texas summers, bring a jacket.
Yes.
Right.
Because it's chilly up there at night.
It is. Well, Andre, thank you so much. Do you have any social media handles or anything that you'd like to share with our audience?
Oh, not really. Trying to think.
Well,
I'm on Facebook.
Well,
Okay.
well, tell them where they can go if they want to see Cosmos or any of the Star Trek reruns.
Oh, sure, yeah. Cosmos you can certainly find. I think it might be on Netflix or Prime. I mean, you can find it. You can find certainly clips of it on YouTube. So it's still out there. You can get the DVDs if you still have a DVD player.
Right.
So yeah, and same with all the Star Trek shows.
It's not hard to
Everywhere.
find Star Trek. Quick question: do you ever watch the original series anymore? Do you ever?
I do. It's like a magnet. I can't. It's on here every Saturday night at 11 p.m.
And the theme song just starts going through my head right now. And Dr. Spock, God love you. And that was great.
Yeah. So what's your next venture? What's your?
Well, I'm developing some other TV show ideas. I worked on Seth MacFarlane's TV series, The Orville, which was a Star Trek-like show.
Right.
Future Starship crew. He plays the captain, and he's terrific to work with.
He
He's a
is.
great writer. So I was on the writing staff, and we're hoping to do another season of that sometime in the not too distant future. So
Awesome.
that Seth MacFarlane, he is one of the most talented people on this planet. He is the width, or the breadth
Versatile.
of talents that he has is amazing.
it's amazing, and he's the nicest guy in the world. He treats everybody the same. I've never heard him raise his voice to anybody, and he's just so smart and so funny. It's just it was just such a pleasure to work with him for 3 seasons on that show, and I hope we get to do more.
Well, I think it's cool the way you have brought science and entertainment together, and then in the end, it actually educates us too.
Right.
So that's pretty cool.
I hope so. I hope so.
Well, it's
So
been
nice
educational
meeting
for us,
you.
for
It's been
sure.
very interesting. So thank you so
Well,
much.
it's been a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much.
And so those of you who are watching Texas 10, we hope you keep watching. Get out there and get out of town. Find some pasture where you can lay out and gaze at the stars, and let's preserve our dark nights, and I think it's very important.
Dark skies.
Dark skies.
Yeah, Dark Nights.
Dark nights and the
was
dark
like-
skies. Dark Knight was a guy that rode, or
Dark skies. And again, biggest recommendation, biggest takeaway is if you can get to McDonald's,
Yes.
do that.
Yes. All right. And keep watching us and join us. Like, share on all of our platforms, and come back to Texas 10.
Thanks.
And I love this land. Oh, it takes my breath away. From Palo Duro to the Gulf Coast plain. From the heart of the hill country to the piney wood shade. I love this land. It takes my breath away.